We all have bad days, and sometimes bad weeks, and maybe even bad years. But the good news is we don't have to figure out life all alone. I'm comedian Chris Duffy, host of TED's How to Be a Better Human podcast. And our show is about the little ways that you can improve your life, actual practical tips that you can put into place that will make your day-to-day better. Whether it is setting boundaries at work or rethinking how you clean your house, each episode has conversations with experts who share tips on how to navigate life's ups and downs. Find How to Be a Better Human wherever you're listening to this.
March is Women's History Month, and that often invites reflection on women's struggles and achievements, as well as ongoing debates about their progress. In the West, those conversations have often assumed that there's just one path to liberation for all women, marked by universal milestones like equal rights, equal pay, or equal access to positions of power. And religion, with its tendency toward defined gender roles anchored in long-standing beliefs and practices, is often cast as holding women back. But is it really? Across the world's major faith traditions, many women are asking a different question. Rather than choosing between their faith and their dignity, they're redefining what liberation looks like on their own terms and challenging their religious communities in ways that make sense to them. Lawyer and writer Dania Suleman is one of those women. In her book, A Different Cloth, Reimagining Faith and Feminism, she argues for a vision of feminism that recognizes religious women's agency and respects their choices, drawing in part from her own experience.
I think I realized later on in my life that it was my first feminist choice when I wore the hijab, because I had to think about it, and I did it because I sincerely believed in it and felt a form of emancipation towards it.
It's one thing to talk about what feminism means in the context of centuries of oppression. But what happens when we widen the lens beyond the patriarchal cultures that help shape many of the world's major faiths? Professor Dianne Stewart is the author of Obeah, Orisha, and Religious Identity in Trinidad, and many other publications about African heritage religions, where she says women have often had a very different kind of experience.
There's no one telling women, you are responsible for the fall of humanity. So women are not feeling some sort of deficit.
Whatever your beliefs about the divine, or about the meaning of equality, we'll explore what women's experiences and spiritual traditions can teach us about freedom, dignity, and how we can all learn to live better together. I'm Dave DeSteno, and this is How God Works, the science behind spirituality.
I went to an all-girls Catholic school, and I was one of the popular kids that, always cracked jokes and had a lot of energy.
At first glance, Dania Suleman's teenage years might seem pretty ordinary. She fit in. She was social and liked to have fun. It wasn't until her last year of high school that things started to look a little different.
When I came back in grade 11, which for us is our graduating year in Montreal, Quebec, a lot of people were surprised and shocked at my choice and wondered if I was indoctrinated.
Dania had started to wear the hijab, the head covering that's worn by many Muslim women around the world. But while that choice may have seemed abrupt to her classmates, to Dania, it felt like the natural outcome of a profound spiritual journey. She'd been raised in a Muslim household, so faith had always been a part of her life. But as a teenager, she began to explore it more intentionally. The summer she was 16, her father offered to send her on a 3-week Islamic retreat in the mountains of New Mexico. That experience would mark the beginning of a deepening relationship to her faith.
It was just the most stunning, incredible retreat I had ever been in my life. We would go hike in the canyons and swim in the rivers, and on top of that, just learn about our faith way beyond, I think, what my parents, who were also working people that I think were teaching me a bit more about the do's and the don'ts, like in a rapid way. And this time I really took the time to go in depth about my faith and its philosophy and the care around it. And I just really fell in love. That's when I started making very meaningful choices with my faith in Islam. It's in those years that I actually decided to wear the hijab.
Were you at all worried about that? Was it a statement of courage or of rebellion or of teaching? Because I can imagine, in some senses, during this time, it was a marker that could bring some possibly negative attention or conflict your way.
Yeah, I don't think it was a marker of rebellion at all. I am someone that is very strong-headed, and since I have been a child, but that was not a choice that I was making in opposition to something. It was very much like me being extremely charmed by virtues of humility and modesty, like understanding the wide scope of it. And to me, that was maybe like embracing like a physical aspect, like a lot of religious symbols are a physical way of trying to perfect a virtue. And it's not just proper to Islam, but many faiths.
Across religious traditions, both women and men use religious symbols, including head coverings, as much more than just a way to signal belonging to a certain group. The turban worn by Sikh men and some Sikh women is meant to signify that all people are equal, among other things. Jewish men often wear a kippah or yarmulke as a reminder of the presence of God and to show reverence and humility in the face of the divine. Similarly, the turbans, takyas, and kufis worn by Muslim men across many cultures express a variety of meanings, including wisdom, modesty, and devotion to God.
It's just like an on-earth way of being like, how can we reinforce a virtue or perfect it or be mindful of it every day? And so in Islam, like hijab is a way to enhance this modesty and humility virtue that is really, really important in our faith, both for men and for women. So it was very much a spiritual choice when I decided to wear the hijab. Because I was also 16, what I did not expect was that choice would then make me the target of a lot of questions and doubts and people stopping me and wondering, was I forced to make that choice? And so with time, it became more of a socio-political endeavor to prove my autonomy, to prove that I'm a woman with intellectual thought, and that obviously no one forced me to do it. No one in my family did, nor did anyone force me to take it off because I don't wear it anymore. But yeah, it was a curious time, and I'm still young at that time, so I don't have the words on everything I'm feeling. And I think I realized later on in my life that it was my first feminist choice when I wore the hijab, because I wouldn't say outcasting myself or alienating myself, but I was definitely making a choice that was not cool or popular or endearing. At this point, we're in 2004, like 3 years post 9/11. Like I said, no one in my grade was wearing a hijab. Very few girls within the whole school were wearing it. So this was not anything that was going to give me any kind of like cultural relevancy. And so I had to think about it. And I did it because I sincerely believed in it and felt a form of emancipation towards it, even though everything around me could have pulled me in another direction to keep going with a life that I had previous to that I still loved and really enjoyed, but I felt called towards that choice. I think I really sat with myself and questioned myself as to whether I wanted to do this and for what reasons. And I even took a year to commit to it. The first year was more me testing it out, and then I became convinced and then decided to commit to hijab. But that's why I would say it was my first feminist choice, because I was doing it for myself, because I felt emancipation and empowerment through it, and because I wasn't doing it because it brought me something in exchange in society.
For Dania, the choice to wear the hijab had felt empowering. But on the national stage, decisions like hers were being interpreted very differently. In Quebec and in other parts of North America and Europe, visible religious symbols were becoming flashpoints in a conversation that increasingly pitted religious freedom against other values, like gender equality. Some argued that religion was actually the cause of women's subordination, and therefore fundamentally at odds with equality. And a few went even further, arguing that displays of religious affiliation like turbans or hijabs actually signified opposition to the law and to civil society. What often went unspoken was how closely these conversations tended to track with rising anxiety around immigration and the growing visibility of minority communities. But perhaps the most common argument among these, and one that's still mainstream today, was that women who wore the hijab were either being forced to do so or so deeply brainwashed they only thought they were making a free choice.
One of my favorite quotes was of the jurist Pascal Fournier, who mentions that how is it that, especially for women, every other choice in our lives gets to have this richness of what influenced us to make that meaningful choice, except for religious choices, especially the female hijab. I find it so interesting, and here I'll also quote Professor Natasha Bach. In her essay, she's asking a lot of questions like, do you not see them in the employment market? Do you not see them challenging claims at the court? Do you not see them being autonomous in their decisions? Other Muslim women go in a university, getting their PhDs, they're working, they're also trying to balance work and family life. And so we see them in so many spheres of their lives having agency, but then somehow when it comes to their religious choice or practice, that'd be the one thing that it would be forced upon them, and there would be a father or a husband or a brother behind that choice, or an oppressive system at large.
By the time Dania became a lawyer in the 2010s, she had seen these arguments follow her into the legal sphere. Proposed legislation like the 2013 Quebec Charter of Values, which would have barred many public employees from wearing visible religious symbols, was framed by some as a way to liberate oppressed hijabi women. It never passed, but a similar measure was enacted in 2019, effectively forcing religious men and women to choose between their turbans, hijabs, and kippas, and their ability to apply for jobs as teachers, police officers, and prosecutors, to name a few. This felt like a step in the wrong direction to Dania. But at the same time, she was heartened to see religious women take on key roles in the legal challenges that followed. And she also started to pay attention to all the other ways, big and small, that religious women were advocating for themselves. And that's what ultimately inspired her to write A Different Cloth, which was originally titled Les Malentendus, or The Women That Are Misunderstood, when she first wrote it in French. In the book, she aims to push back against the narrative that religious women are passive or brainwashed in two ways. First, by showing they're actively defending their religious freedom in secular spaces like the courts, but also, crucially, by highlighting the many ways in which they're challenging the gender inequality they see in their own faith communities.
There can be a tension between faith, religion, and feminism and gender equality, but I feel like patriarchy or sexism has made its way in so many spheres of society, not just faith. It's been part of also political spaces and academia and music and cultural life and literacy. Truly, we're now in the past 100 or 200 years having a lot of more female authors, but for a long time it was mostly men writing. And so it feels like we've given this legitimacy for feminism to challenge all these spaces, and we believe in their agency, and we believe that it's possible that these institutions or spaces can be changed. But somehow when it comes to religion, we see it as like forever fixed, forever archaic, impossible of movement, of being challenged.
In reality, Dania argues, religious women are rethinking how their faith is practiced and creating change on many levels. And they have been for a long time. In Islam, women served as scholars, teachers, and political figures from the earliest days, starting with one of the Prophet Muhammad's own wives, Aisha, who narrated over 2,000 hadiths. Reformers like the West African poet and scholar Nana Asma'u were advancing women's rights in education long before the term feminism entered the mainstream in the West. That legacy continues today in the work of scholars like Asma Lamhabet, whose writing both questions misogynistic readings of the Quran and resists the narrative that Muslim women can only be liberated by adopting a secular Western model.
So like her book, Woman in the Quran, an emancipatory reading, that's her trying to do reinterpretations and re-looking at controversial verses, their meaning, how that evolves through time. I don't even know that if she would call it a reinterpretation. I think she would argue that she's trying to look back at the original meaning of what some of these words meant, especially in maybe verses that have been more controversial throughout time. Also placing the focus on where is God talking to women about women's affair as well. And just to be clear, Asma Lamkhabet is a Moroccan woman, lived her whole life there. She's a doctor as well. This is not her living, let's say, in the Western world and feeling challenged within maybe secular society and wanting to revisit her faith. This is a woman that's born and raised in Morocco, a traditional society, and still wanting to investigate her faith and try to understand, like, where did we go wrong? How is it that we had a beginning of Islam that felt so radical towards women's right, and now we're in societies where I can go out past 8 p.m. I'm giving this as an example, but to say, why is it that things feel more constrained?
For Asma Lamkhabet, returning to the Quran is a way of separating the sacred text from the patriarchal readings that have come to dominate conservative Islamic traditions. Rather than accept those interpretations as inevitable, she treats them as historically shaped. Others choose to focus less on the roots of inequality and instead address how it shows up in everyday religious life, such as the separate spaces where men and women pray. One of the more powerful examples of that approach comes from Chicago activist Hind Maki.
She developed this project called Side Entrance to talk about how a lot of mosques do not give like a beautiful, equitable space for women as they do to men. And she was saying that the majority of response were men being shocked that they had no idea that we, sometimes couldn't see the imam when we were praying, that our side of the mosque was not so nice. And so that raised an immense call to action. And so the Islamic Society of North America, ISNA, they started doing like a national call to have every mosque give like an equitable, beautiful space to women as they do to men. So to me, that's a valid feminist stance of saying, I love my faith, but I don't feel welcomed here. How can I challenge it?
For some women, the answer to this question has been to push the boundaries even further, like when Dr. Amina Wadud made headlines when she led a Mixed Gender Friday prayer, arguing for gender equality in Islamic spaces. Others have chosen to step away from unwelcoming spaces and create women-only mosques. And some women decide to break entirely with practices they consider unjust. The point, Dania argues, isn't to decide which of these strategies is the right one. It's to recognize that all of these women are exercising agency in ways that make sense to them. That insight reflects a broader strand of post-colonial feminism, articulated by thinkers like Chandra Talpade Mohanty, who challenges the assumption that there is only one way for women to be empowered.
She was famous for saying that within modern philosophy, we tend to use these capitalized letters to talk about a concept. So democracy with a capital D and justice with a capital J. So it's this idea there's just one version of the truth, one version of justice, one version of democracy. And in that way, early feminism in the 20th century would talk about women with a capital W. And it kind of inferred that we have all the same struggle. We're all trying to achieve liberation in the same way. And Chandra Talpade, who's of Indian origin, is the one that said we need to stop using that capital W because women are so diverse in their lived experiences and even of oppression. So what could be oppressive in one setting would not be in another one. And so she was advocating to use the term woman, but with a small w. In that, she's also proposing that different women will use different terms and definitions and parameters to explain what feels liberating for them. And to me, maybe an example of it, to use the hijab, is that hijab being forced is completely oppressive. But hijab being forced to be taken off of a woman's head that, like we've seen with certain bills in Quebec, in France, and even in secular Tunisia a few years ago, that's also oppressive. It's the fact that you're trying to decide for a woman what is meant to be her means to her liberation.
Religious feminists like Dania expand our understanding of what feminism can look like. They remind us that just as people may hold different ideas about what makes a meaningful life, women may also hold different visions of justice and freedom, and different strategies for getting there. But that raises another question. What happens when we look beyond the religions that developed in the Mediterranean and Middle East, where many cultures were already structured by a specific gender hierarchy? What might women's experiences be in spiritual traditions shaped by a different logic? On the African continent, many traditions developed with a distinct understanding of how the sacred operates in everyday life, and of where women fit within the social and spiritual order. From the 16th to the 19th centuries, enslaved Africans from West and Central Africa brought that understanding with them to places like Brazil, Cuba, Haiti, and the many other parts of the Caribbean and United States where they were forced to migrate. There, these spiritual worlds evolved into traditions like Vodou, Santeria, Candomblé, and Hoodoo. Dr. Dianne Stewart studies the African roots of this family of traditions and its many branches in the diaspora. She told me that before we can talk about how they might lead to a different kind of experience for women, it helps to understand that in these traditions, the sacred isn't confined to a separate sphere. It animates the world itself. Dianne calls this neutral mystical power.
Most of the African heritage traditions I know of, they have this understanding of some power that infuses the universe. In the Yoruba tradition, it's Ashe. It's the power to make things happen. It's not the power to make good things happen. It's not the power to make bad things happen. It's the power to make things happen. And that's what I mean. This concept that there is power in our world. There's power in everything around us. In these traditions, there are rituals, there are invocations, there are processes that people can undergo to access that power. Many practitioners, like current day practitioners of African heritage religions, especially in the diaspora, they don't like to even think of themselves as practicing a religion. They like to think of themselves as engaged in a way of life, a culture that is deeply spiritually grounded and informs how they make relationships and create sociality and follow their path, which they understand as a kind of divinely inspired path. They encompass life in their totality. That sacred secular distinction is not as sharp in those traditions.
That lack of sharp boundaries isn't just a feature of how practitioners understand the world. It also shows up in the way these traditions are passed on from one person to the next.
So because they are primarily oral traditions, I think that gives some fluidity and perhaps creative license. They are traditionally family, clan, or ethnic religions. They're not preached. They're not confessional religions. Their aim is not to convert others or to view it as even desirable to have voluntary conversion. I think they would just be neutral about that. Yeah, fine. If you want to join, you want to join. But it's not a goal. It's not an aim. The aim is to focus on practice and remaining in relationship with the spiritual world through rituals, obligations, and other acts of service, as opposed to through confessing faith.
I want to explore that in a little more detail because I think the U.S. being primarily a Christian nation, though there are all faiths represented here, we kind of have this idea that faith is more about what you believe than about what you do. It's more about creed than about practice. And it sounds like from what you're saying is the sacred in Africana heritage religions is more just intermixed with the body, with doing, with rituals, with the rhythms of life. And so I'm wondering, is the emphasis that these traditions place on practice rather than the profession of faith? Do you think those distinctions might be playing a role in creating a different type of experience for women than we see in the Abrahamic faiths?
I think so. And let me at least start with the Abrahamic faith that I grew up in. There's no one telling women, you are responsible for the fall of humanity. That alone, I mean, they're not
That's
starting.
a rough place to start.
That's a rough place to start, right? I love the way Professor Ibusi Bulaga, he's now late, but he was a brilliant Cameroonian philosopher and theologian, says, in African religions, people come into the world with a debt owed. They don't come into the world with original sin. They come into the world owing a debt, and that debt is to transmit humanity to the next generation. And so the religions are oriented to educate and give initiates opportunities to grow and mature in their spiritual responsibility to be able to do that. So the women are not feeling some sort of deficit or somehow feeling like I am less than, right? Or I am inferior to men. Not the way this tradition orients itself or these sets of traditions orient themselves. Usually people are, when a baby is born into the tradition, there's usually divination to understand that child's purpose, divine purpose. And then the child is set on a path, or say the new initiate when we're talking about later day converts, they're set on a path to be able to explore that.
We look to our deities, our spirits, in whatever faith we have, for guidance, for comfort. I'm wondering if we feel a greater connection to them because we feel they share our experience of life, they understand us more, if they're the same sex as we are, if that matters. In other words, do you think it matters or it's appealing for women in these traditions to have female deities?
Oh, yes, it is. Again, if you are socialized in a tradition where all the important deities are male, and when it comes on to women of African descent, are white male, they're presented as white and male, encountering and engaging images of the divine that look like you, that are dark complexioned, that are female, does so much for the confidence, the psychological health, emotional wellness, spiritual optimism of the initiate or of the devotee. I have talked to several women who said that this is something that truly attracted them to the tradition, that they could relate to Black African female deities that mattered to them, especially having come out of Abrahamic traditions, especially Christianity and for some Islam.
Representation is an important part of the story, especially for converts who may be coming from contexts where they didn't feel valued or even included. But the appeal of African heritage traditions for women goes much deeper.
These traditions are not based on gender-based reasoning. They're more based on seniority. Where gender comes in, they're based more on gender balance rather than gender hierarchy. So I think that is a very important difference. There can be separate roles, but when I say even gender balance, I mean having both males and females represented in whatever is happening, even if they are playing the same role.
That same logic is reflected in the way the divine world is imagined too.
There are multiple female deities, and some might seem to, and of course, their roles and responsibilities would be influenced by gender experiences in the colonial Americas. And so you will see some where there are stereotypic kinds of features associated with them, but then there are so many where there aren't stereotypic features. And also, depending on where you are, the gender of certain deities might change. So I'm thinking about Ochosi, the hunter deity. Ochosi is female in Yoruba land, in West Africa. But in the diaspora, Ochosi became male. And even when we think of those female Orisha or deities, I keep focusing on Yoruba because that's the tradition I study the most. But this would be true across Vodou and Akan-based traditions. They still have such a range of characteristics and personalities and elements that would span both masculine and feminine qualities in terms of the way we tend to understand them as rigidly divided. One of the major female deities, Oshun, she's often thought about for her beauty, but she is the owner of the marketplace. If you want to deal with stocks, you're going to go do devotional work to Oshun. You're not going to any male deity. So, as much as Oshun can be sweet, she can be tormentous too. They would have those aggressive qualities and those softer qualities as well. And you can see that even with the male deities.
I think that's really important because it's showing the kind of heterogeneous nature of the deities that are assigned a gender. That is, they have masculine and feminine sides. But it's also the sense that when we speak about God or powerful spirits, We're using both pronouns. I mean, one thing, to this day, it is still very difficult for me by habit. When I'm writing about God, I will say he until I correct myself. But I think just that language itself has a tremendous power in the lens through which we view the world.
I'm glad you bring that up because it allows me to talk about something else that is so difficult to access because of our having been socialized in the diaspora into Western languages. And when we're getting to languages like French and Spanish, oh my goodness, they are highly gendered, even more gendered than English. But these West and West Central, Niger-Congo based, these are all part of the Niger-Congo language family. Those languages are non-gendered. They are non-gendered languages. So, for example, I remember when I was doing research on my book on Trinidad, one of the things I came across was that in the 19th century, and presumably before that, there wasn't even a word for sister or brother. It would be sibling. The word was elder sibling or junior sibling because of the significance of seniority, or even the way you would say a boy in the Yoruba language, it would be child anatomical male or girl, child anatomical female. Child comes first.
This emphasis on relationship over gender makes sense when you consider how these traditions took shape, not as institutions built to spread a universal message, but as ways of life for families and clans. Ancestor veneration is central, and the dead remain active members of the community, sometimes believed to return as children born into the same lineage. Even deities are a kind of divine community, with families and relationships of their own. And because these traditions were passed down in families, that logic also shapes how communities of worship are organized, not as churches or congregations, but as houses, spiritual families guided by respected elders.
The way many women and persons in general are initiated or end up belonging to a community is they do it through the guidance of a spiritual parent. They're often called padrinos and madrinas in Brazil and Cuba, but we can just call them a spiritual parent, spiritual mentor. They belong to the same spiritual house, and they begin to learn the tradition by assisting with preparing for ceremonies, preparing for initiations, helping to cook the food, helping to purchase items, to arrange the altars, to clean the environment, the spiritual home. Life is definitely full of ceremony, rituals, devotional practices. So that is the focus. It's not so much the focus on this is your gender, and so therefore you're only limited in these spaces. I'm not saying that sexism and patriarchy has not influenced these traditions, especially in the diaspora. I don't want to give that impression. But I would say in a much less pronounced way than we would see them in the Abrahamic institutionalized faith.
In this model of spirituality, ritual isn't something you observe from the pews. It's something you take an active part in. That's an empowering experience in and of itself. And in many cases, initiates don't just help prepare for ceremonies, they take a central role.
They are also acting as mediums in ceremonies. The deities, the ancestors are coming into their body cavities, and they are speaking for the divine as well. So that idea that, for example, some Christian churches where a woman might not even be able to stand behind a pulpit. And I hate to say this, but this has been common in a number of Black Baptist and Pentecostal type churches. Not all, but that has been common traditionally. Women in these African heritage religions are representing the divine. They're also serving as ushers and interpreters too, because there is a whole practice of care around the visitation of a spirit. We have to make sure that they're not harming themselves or what have you during the ceremony. And so women function in those roles as well.
In systems where women are not marked as spiritually deficient, and where authority is cultivated through participation rather than restricted by gender, it's hardly surprising that women also tend to emerge as leaders. Across the diaspora, women frequently stand at the head of these communities, and that's especially evident in Trinidad, where Dianne has done much of her research.
Trinidad is such an important case because they've achieved the most out of any religious community across any diaspora location. The kinds of recognition and acknowledgement they have received from their government and the way the image of the tradition has been able to be transformed by them, by their sheer efforts, is just singular and quite fascinating. I think culturally, they are so oriented in a tradition where women are visible, they're present, they have authority. It's just not questioned. There's so many spiritual mothers at the heads of the different, they're called iles or shrines or spiritual houses. No one questions it because they're the ones teaching us. They're the ones passing this along. Not just women, there are men, but there's so many women. When a study was done in the 1990s of how many shrines were operative across the island, most of them were operated by women. We have 2 women at the head of the first 2 Orisha organizations to be incorporated by an act of the Parliament of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. So Egbe Orisha Ilewa, headed by Iya Melvina Rodney, received their incorporation in 1981. And then 10 years later, Opa Orisha Shango, headed by Iya Mali Ahi, received their incorporation. 2 women. When Trinidad decided to, the Orisha community there decided to organize what they called the National Council of Orisha Elders. Who was the head? Iya Rodney. And just to show you how seniority really works, it was said that when the Oni of Ife, this is the head of the spiritual head of all Orisha practitioners around the world, it would be like the Pope visiting. He appointed Iya Rodney to be the spiritual head because she was the most knowledgeable. Her lineage traced right back to continental Africa within 2 generations. And so that's a good example of what I mean. The Oni of Ife comes and he appoints a woman as a spiritual head. So under her leadership, let me tell you the kinds of things that they achieved. They achieved receiving land grants from the government so that they can organize activities, huge land grants, the repeal of repressive legislation censoring African religions, the Orisha Marriage Act, which authorized registered priests and priestesses to officiate Orisha wedding ceremonies. The other thing they achieved was the option for Orisha practitioners to swear on the iron, the sword of Ogun, their deity of justice, rather than the Bible in court when giving sworn testimony. And after Iya Rodney died in 2009, by 2011, they had succeeded in having Orisha added to the national census as categories for religious affiliation.
Taking a step back from this, I'm thinking especially in our country, the U.S. right now, it sounds like you think these traditions can teach us something, if we take them seriously, about women's agency or different ways to think about what feminism might mean. And so what wisdom do you think they offer us that may help us redefine the way we think about feminism, regardless of our specific theology in this country?
I would say that they are anchored in an ontology. By ontology, I mean the nature of being that is much more fluid than the Abrahamic faiths. So what I mean is plants, humans, animals, mineral life all belong to the same family. They really are our siblings. It's also very indigenous, very Native American way of thinking as well. But I do think that begins to disrupt this intense focus on the essence of maleness and the essence of femaleness, or man and woman. When we begin to think of what it means to be related to one another in deeply intrinsic ways. And so I think it does teach us something about the dignity that all life deserves. Because feminism, womanism, as some of us would embrace, it does begin with a concern for the denigration, the disrespect, the unfair treatment, its codification in our laws, in our culture, in our religions. It does definitely begin with a concern for that, but it is concerned about human relationality with our wider world, our natural environment as well. And so I think African heritage religion situates us in a philosophy that reorients our deep focus on bifurcation rather than connection. I always say these traditions, in the West, we think about, I think, therefore I am, or we think about being, they think about belonging. What does it mean to belong to one another? And that puts us not on a track of gender division, but the unification of communities.
When we start with bifurcation, by dividing the world into categories like men and women, sacred and secular, mind and body, the next step is often to decide how those categories should be ordered. Which is more important? Whose voice carries more weight? But if the starting point is belonging, the question shifts. It's no longer about hierarchy, but about how to live together and what each person can contribute to the life of the community, whether that community includes the entirety of the natural and spiritual world or simply the other members of a faith. The women we've heard about today are part of that larger conversation. Across cultures and traditions, they're asking what liberation looks like from within their own communities. And no matter what we believe, their stories are a good reminder that achieving justice is about more than just rearranging the pecking order. After all, the search for meaning and dignity is something we're all engaged in, together. Next time, the first of a special two-part series on doubt and faith. It's true that doubt can erode trust in God. So as more and more people leave organized religion, we'll ask, is doubt the problem? Or could it actually be the answer to the modern crisis of faith?
God calls some people to unbelief so that faith can find new forms. And I think that God is always seeking new forms of faith.
We'll hear from a psychologist, Christian poet, and rabbi about the wisdom different traditions offer and about how to approach doubt and even embrace it to strengthen spirituality and well-being.
Doubting is associated with an open, curious, humble approach where you're searching for meaning in life and holding religious beliefs that are more universal and more complex. So there's a lot to be excited about in terms of people who have the courage to question their beliefs.
That's next time on How God Works, the science behind spirituality. How God Works is hosted by me, Dave DeSteno. This episode was written by Sophie Eisenberg and me. Our senior producer is Josie Holtzman. Our producer is Sophie Eisenberg. Our associate producer is Emmanuel Desarme. Executive producer is Genevieve Sponsler. Our fact checker is Natsumi Ajisaka. Merritt Jacob is our mix engineer and composed our theme, which was arranged by Chloe DeSteno. The executive producer of PRX Productions is Jocelyn Gonzalez. This podcast was made possible with support from the John Templeton Foundation. To learn more about the show and access episode transcripts, you can find our website at howgodworks.org. And for episode shorts, extras, and my ruminations on science and spirituality, check us out on Instagram. And you can also see all of our episodes along with special bonus show material on our YouTube page at How God Works Pod.